Imagine a world free of disease, death, and aging. We believe that day is coming. Our mission is to extend human lifespans by preserving the body, with the goal of revival by future science. So this little quote here is taken directly from the homepage of the so-called Cryonics Institute. You see, somewhere in Michigan, there's a company that specializes in overcoming human death. Its customers agree to be transported directly to the institute immediately after their death. There, their bodies slowly cool down to minus 196 degrees Celsius before the frozen body is put in a container filled with liquid nitrogen. Hundreds of corpses already rest there, deep frozen in a container grave, and thousands of others have already paid to find the same frozen resting place as soon as their heart stops beating. So why would someone do this? Why would someone pay to be frozen and stored in liquid nitrogen after their death, one might ask? And the answer is that the people that signed up with the Cryonics Institute believe that science will one day be able to revive corpses, as long as they were preserved properly. They believe that their frozen bodies will be in good enough shape to be revived at some point in the future. What the Cryonics Institute is selling their customers is a return from death. It is a certain idea of immortality. So, the scientific community is highly skeptical that revival in this form will ever be possible, and that is ignoring the other problem of such a company, the obvious economic problem. You know, it's kinda hard to run a business for potentially thousands of years if all your customers are legally dead. But you know what? Let's ignore those little party crashing problems for a second, and let's pretend that this actually works. Let's pretend for a second that it actually would be possible to return from the dead this way. Let's pretend that people would certainly come back from death at some point in the future if we just freeze them hard enough today. Because if we pretend this were possible, then this raises a really interesting philosophical question. Is it a good idea to live in the knowledge that we will eventually be immortal? What does it mean to live a life in the knowledge that death is reversible and that we'll never truly die? Is it a good idea to sign up for such an immortality service if we pretend that it would actually work? Or is there an argument to be made not to do so? And if not, why? And as most of you exceptionally sharp viewers probably already guessed, those questions are not just fun to think about, they are also the questions that are at the heart of Outer Wilds' wonderful DLC, Echoes of the Eye. Echoes of the Eye offers a crystal clear answer to those questions. The game has a very strong opinion on whether it is a good idea to strive for immortality or not. So in this video, we're going on quite an unusual journey. We will first revisit Outer Wilds' wonderful DLC. We'll explore the strange alien station that is hidden in the solar system and dig up its many mysteries together. We will stop and discuss interesting things along the way. We will take a deep dive into the psychology and philosophy of human immortality and death, dig up some 1,000-year-old writings on the matter, and in the end, we'll take a look at what answer Echoes of the Eye gives to the question of whether it is a good idea to strive for immortality. Awesome. So we got quite an alien space station to explore ahead of us. Before we start, just one more thing. Because of the nature of this video will contain heavy spoilers for Outer Wilds and Echoes of the Eye, including the final boss fight. Don't worry, that is not the final boss fight in the background yet, that's just an out of bounds glitch. Hooray! My name is Ceave, you're watching Ceave Perspective, a place that hopes to get interesting perspective in great games. This is Echoes of the Eye. The Deep Space Satellite has recorded something strange. You see, the Harthians put a satellite deep into space to observe the solar system. It floats up there, far away from all the planets, taking pictures. Yet one of the pictures shows something weird. At a certain angle, the satellite repeatedly photographs a strange black artifact right in front of the sun. What is going on here? And thus, we hop in our spaceship to investigate. But when we reach the satellite, we soon realize it is not the satellite that is malfunctioning. There truly is something dark right in front of the sun. A pitch black object. An object that mysteriously floats in our solar system. An object that seems to absorb all light. and thus we carefully fly towards it. As we get closer, the mysterious object grows larger and larger. Suddenly, it blocks our vision of the sun, before all of a sudden this happens. Suddenly we break through the black fog that blocks our vision, and a gigantic dark alien spaceship appears right in front of us. A spaceship made of technology that we have never encountered before. Everything here is dark and intimidating. We explore the strange space station. There's an entrance that leads us into a dark, tucked away chamber. A mysterious round object is in the center of this room. Other than that, there is nothing but a switch. And thus we turn the gear, and then the big reveal suddenly happens. The platform we stand on drops down, and suddenly we float down a wild river. We look up and see that the river extends to the ceiling. We just entered a gigantic looping space station. The raft floats to a small platform, and there it is pulled upwards. We're suddenly in the middle of a wooden village built by civilization we never encountered before. So this moment here, the moment when we drop into the stranger and discover the looping river inside of it, this here is one of my favorite moments in all of gaming. The contrast between the dark and unsettling outside of the space station and the wild, untouched nature of the interior is just so jaw-dropping, it gets me every time. Here's the thing, however. The fact that this moment works so phenomenally is not by circumstance. As a matter of fact, they spend an incredible amount of resources just to make sure that this very moment hits as hard as it does. So check this out. First, we very likely never enter the stranger through this entrance ever again. Once we enter the strange space station once, we can fly directly towards it. If we fly directly towards it, however, we enter it from the other side. So they built an entire entrance setup just for this one reveal, which is already quite interesting. But that's not all, because they even designed the entire layout of the river in such a way that this moment works perfectly. Just take a look at the structure of the river. This is the arm in which we drop down at the beginning. The arm fulfills no other function but to funnel us towards the landing spot. The entire part of the map is designed just to make sure that the very moment of us dropping into the stranger feels as impactful as possible. And it's not just this moment that they designed with so much care. There is the moment when the dark fog in front of us suddenly dissolves and reveals the space station. There are many moments later in the DLC that were crafted with an insane amount of care, like the moment when the music suddenly stops in a mansion. There are lots of incredible moments in the base game, like everyone's favorite anglerfish puzzle, or the moment we encounter the Nomai on the Quantum Moon, that are incredibly memorable and well crafted. In my humble opinion, one of the greatest strengths of Outer Wilds is how incredibly intense some moments in the game end up being. I believe that they put in a ton of care and resources into those moments to make sure that they hit as hard as they do. Resources that, at least in my opinion, were well spent. Hooray! And thus we explore the mysterious place that we just entered. There are paintings of strange owl-like elk creatures on the walls. We find murals depicting peaceful owl elks living in an alien solar system that we never visited. We encounter ghost matter, meaning that the strange spaceship had already been in the solar system when the interloper exploded. We continue to explore, and after a while, we find our very first slide reel. So the slide reels. In Echoes of the Eye, the story is not told via text, but mainly via those slide reels that we find. Those reels show us a short movie-like presentation of something that had happened in the past. Via those reels, we slowly puzzle together what had happened on the space station and to the mysterious race of owl elks. And one of those reels tells us something particularly strange, something quite mysterious. You see, one of the reels tells us about an event that must have been of great importance for the mysterious owl elks that built the spaceship. We sadly do not learn what exactly had happened, as the reel is unfortunately damaged, but we learn what happened immediately afterwards. Whatever had happened before, it had a massive impact on the owl elks. It caused them to build a huge sarcophagus-like contraption and to use it to seal something away. If we continue to explore the strange space station, we will eventually run into this very sarcophagus. Whatever terrified them, it is probably still locked up firmly inside, sunken under the current, locked up tight in the murky water. So this thing here, this prison that is sunken below the water, is quite interesting, because this prison here terrified me when I first played the game. Very few things in all of gaming ever made me as scared as this weird underwater prison did. But the reason why I was so afraid ultimately had nothing to do with the game. The reason this underwater prison scared me so much is something entirely different. If there is one thing that the original Dark Souls is known for, then it is for being a really difficult game. And rightfully so. Nowadays, people are used to the difficulty of the Souls games, but when the game first released, people really had never encountered a modern game that was this punishing, difficult and unforgiving. Its many unusual design choices really caught people off guard. And thus, the game quickly gained a reputation for being brutally difficult, a reputation that the marketing of the game cleverly leaned into. And this is where things become interesting. You see, early in the game, we reach the Firelink Shrine, an area that is basically the game's hub. Several areas are connected to this spot. Early game areas that we're supposed to go to, but also late game areas that we certainly are not supposed to go to yet. And one of those late game areas is the crypt. So to make sure that people don't venture into the crypt early, the developers put a bunch of really high-level skeleton enemies in front of the entrance. The idea being really simple. Players that try to venture early into this area will soon realize that the enemies are way too tough for them and thus retreat and look for another place to explore first. Which brings us to a little problem they encountered, and the reason I bring this up, because lots of people simply did not realize that the enemies were too difficult for them yet. After all, everyone knows that Dark Souls is an incredibly difficult game. Many players thus came to the conclusion that the game is just meant to be this difficult, that the game actually wants them to beat the skeletons in front of the crypt, that this is the intended difficulty. A misconception that has led to many stories of people becoming incredibly frustrated with the game early on. So here's where this gets interesting. You see, it's not necessarily the designer's fault that the players did not understand that those enemies were far out of their league yet. Usually players understand the message when enemies one-shot them left and right. It is, however, also not necessarily the player's fault. After all, they've been told over and over again how difficult the game was. They just assumed that the game really is this difficult. But if it isn't the developer's fault that this happened, and if the players aren't to blame, then what caused this little mess? And the answer is obviously the marketing did. The marketing had such an impact on what people expected from the game that it actively changed how people played it. So why do I bring up that people played Dark Souls differently just because of the narratives that the marketing used to sell the game in a video about Echoes of the Eye? One might ask. Well, because the very same thing actually happened to me when I played Echoes of the Eye for the very first time, and it happened right in front of the odd sunken sarcophagus. You see, Echoes of the Eye had a very unusual marketing campaign. The marketing told us almost nothing about what to expect in the game. Almost nothing, except one crucial little detail. The marketing told people that the DLC is actually so scary that the developers saw themselves forced to add an option to the menu, an option to reduce the frights. And this fact, the fact that playtesters were incredibly scared by the game, was the only piece of information that I knew when I first booted up the game. And here I was, playing the DLC for the very first time, running around, slowly wondering where all the terrors were hiding. Until now, I didn't find the game very terrifying. Everything seemed quite peaceful so far. And then I realized something. The terrible things were probably hidden. They were probably hidden underwater. After all, Outer Wilds is the anglerfish game. And thus I was standing on the shores of this lake, utterly terrified to dive into the murky waters. Here's the thing. There is nothing in the water. There is nothing to be afraid of. Diving into the water is completely safe. There is barely anything in the water at all. I was terrified of nothing. So strangely enough, the fact that I was terrified of the water during my first playthrough actually added to my experience the first time through. It made the water feel so dangerous, it really had an impact on how I experienced the game. But I think there's also a lesson hidden within this strange tale. You see, the marketing really should be careful with the narratives that they put out there pre-release, because those narratives can actively change how people interact with the game. Awesome. So during my first playthrough, I was scared of imaginative things underwater, even though the danger was not underwater, it was right in front of me. You see, this little lake is right besides a huge dam, and this very dam is slowly breaking. After roughly half a cycle, it breaks down, flooding the entire area and killing everything close to it. Ouch. We slowly continue to explore the alien space station. We learn about a strange alien candle that the owl elks used to go to sleep with. We enter the sunken prison and find the locked sarcophagus there. It is sealed with 3 seals. But strangest of all, eventually we learn that there are actually hidden rooms in the towers. If we remove all light sources in front of one of the murals, the path to a hidden staircase opens up. If we walk down into the basement, then we make a terrifying discovery. Because deep down, below the 3 towers, there's something hidden, something dead. The long rotten corpses of the owl elks that built the space station. They all went into those rooms to die, all of them holding a strange blue candle in their mummified hands. At this point, we are maximally confused. We know very little about the strange owl elks yet. We learned a little bit about their history, but we have no idea what had happened to them. Why did they experiment with those blue candles? What did they do? Why did they all die together in this almost ritualistic way? And worst of all, what did they seal away in the prison before they all died together? We can't make any sense out of all of this so far. But before we solve this mystery and take a look at the tragedy that caused all the owl elks to die together at the bottom of their towers, we first have to establish something completely different. If we want to understand the themes of the story behind Echoes of the Eye, we do not only have to retell the story of the owl elks, we also have to discuss the psychological and philosophical motives behind it. We have to talk about the psychology of immortality first. And we have to climb a mountain. It's the 6th of June, 1924. It's 8:30 in the morning. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine are leaving their camp. In Mallory's pocket, a picture of his wife. He had carried this picture with him throughout the entire expedition. It was finally time for him to bury the picture, to bury it on the summit. You see, when George Mallory left his tent that fateful day, he left it with the goal of achieving something that no one before him had ever achieved. He set out to be the first person to ascend to the top of Mount Everest. That day, he left the camp at around 7,000 meters and set out to manage the final climb that no one before had ever successfully done. And up until today, we do not know what happened next. Here's a fun thought experiment. Imagine we abduct a young child and raise it in a scientifically controlled environment. We treat the child well, we give it all it needs, it is raised in the same way normal children are. There's just one crucial difference. We never tell the kid what death is. We never tell it that everything that lives is fleeting. We don't tell it that its parents will die one day. We do not tell it that the child itself is mortal. We do not tell it that animals or plants die. We do not read stories to the child in which someone dies. Nothing. We raise the kid without ever giving it any hint that something like death does exist in this world. So, such an experiment would obviously be extremely unethical, but I don't care. It's a thought experiment. My thought experiments can be as unethical as I want them to be. So here's the question. If we somehow manage to pull this off, if we were to raise a kid that never once encounters mortality or death in any form, does the child eventually realize that it is mortal by itself? Or is there no way to come to this conclusion if we never learn about death in our environment? And I believe the answer to this question is no. I don't think that we would know that we are mortal if we did not learn about it at some point. So if I'm right with my suspicion, then this has really interesting consequences, because it would mean that our idea of our own mortality is socially constructed and not biologically hardwired. And if we take a look at the rest of living creatures around us, this would actually make a lot of sense. Trees and flowers are not aware that they are mortal after all. Neither are cats, dogs, humpback whales, hedgehogs or tamarins. Most living organisms organisms don't seem to be aware of their own mortality. But at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, we poor humans fell out of our coconut tree, and evolution had all of a sudden made us intelligent enough to understand that things around us die, intelligent enough to understand that we ourselves will die, and worst of all, evolution even made us intelligent enough to share the bad news. At some point in human history, we reach a level of intelligence that is high enough to understand our own mortality, and we're suddenly capable of sharing this knowledge with our offspring and the people around us. Quite the event. In my opinion, the case can be made that it was this very event when we stopped being apes and transformed into man. So all of this obviously didn't happen from one moment to the other. It's a slow-moving process over generations, but nonetheless it did happen at some point in human history. And this changed the fact that at some point we gained knowledge of our mortality, and the mortality of everyone around us confronted our ape-shaped ancestors with quite the problem. They're the first animals in creation that suddenly understand their own mortality and are able to share the news. As they say, in the beginning there was the Word. We're back with Mallory and Irvin, who just began their climb to the top. While we ultimately do not know what happened to the two of them on that fateful day, we do know one thing with certainty. Both of them would not survive their attempt to climb to the top of Mount Everest. Within the next few days, both of them were dead. What we do not know, however, is how exactly the two died. Up until today, we do not know if they found their end while they were on the way up to the summit or while they were on their way down. Or, in other words, up until today, it is not certain whether George Mallory and Andrew Irvin were the first people to ever stand atop the summit of Mount Everest, or if they died before they made it to the top of the mountain. So, modern research seems to suggest that it would have been extraordinarily difficult for the two to actually reach the summit that day, given the weather conditions that they were facing. However, in 1999, when Malroy's body was finally found, the picture of his wife was no longer in his pockets. Until someone finds the camera that Irvin was carrying somewhere on the mountain, we can't tell with absolute certainty who the first person was to ever reach the top of Mount Everest. A mystery that has led to much research and even more speculation over the years. This here is Ernest Becker, a social anthropologist who caused quite a quarrel with a little book that he published all the way back in 1973. His book carried the delightful title The Denial of Death, and it's mainly a commentary on the work of another delighting fellow. This little fellow here, Sigmund Freud, the daddy of psychoanalysis. You see, the times of Daddy Freud were different to ours. Back in the late 19th century, psychology wasn't as developed a field as it is today. As a matter of fact, psychology was still in its infancy. Many ideas that we take for granted nowadays have not been academically formulated yet. For example, the idea that there might be a subconsciousness below our actual consciousness hasn't been thought of yet. The idea that we might be repressing memories or experiences wasn't widely spread. The idea that we might develop mental problems if we force ourselves to repress certain parts of us or certain desires wasn't really a thing. Or that traumatic repressed childhood memories may cause us mental problems later in life. All of those ideas weren't public knowledge as they are today. About 150 years ago, we simply didn't really know that there even was such a thing as a subconsciousness, nor did we know of all its effects on our mental health and human behavior. And along comes Freud to change this. Freud single-handedly fathers psychoanalysis, and with it we get our modern understanding of repression, the subconscious, transference, and much, much, much more. Freud's work is so important and so influential in so many areas, it's utter insanity. There's just one problem with Freud's otherwise brilliant writings. Daddy Freud is a bit of a horny old perv. Freud tries to explain almost all of the psychological subconscious processes that go on in our mind via sexual desires and fears. He believes that boys develop an Oedipus complex because they feel sexual desires for their mothers and in turn wish their fathers dead. He believes that women have penis envy, which he means literally. He suspects men to experience castration anxiety and thinks it originates in the realization that biological female bodies are lacking a penis, and so on. So I'm not saying that all of those things do not exist, most of them probably do, but I'm also not the first to suggest that Freud may have gone a bit overboard with how much emphasis he put on the sexual when it comes to his theories. But at the same time, Freud undoubtedly left us tons of brilliant observations. He just overemphasized the role of sexuality when it came to explaining the origins of his otherwise brilliant observations. And thus, lots of bright bubbles worked themselves through Freud's work, trying to figure out what the actual origin for all his brilliant observations is, if not everything we do is rooted in general perversion. Which brings us back to our buddy Becker, because Becker's book is basically an attempt to correct Freud, and his book, The Denial of Death, ended up making quite an impact. It sold thousands over thousands of copies, it won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 1974, and it is the foundation upon which TMT, or terror management theory, is built upon, a concept in modern psychology. So what were Becker's hot takes on the ideas of Freud that caused such an earthquake? Well, as I understand the friendly fellow, he basically argues that the core repression mechanisms of the self are not rooted in sexuality, but in the knowledge of our own mortality. Becker argues that there are two conflicting and basically incompatible parts out of which every single one of us is made. A symbolic self on the one side and a biological self on the other. So unsurprisingly, the biological self refers to our body. It's our arms and legs, it's what we feel when we touch something, the hunger we experience, it's the urge to visit the toilet regularly, it's the thing in which we live that requires somewhat regular sleep, feels great when drunk but hangover the next day, and it is the thing that ouches extraordinarily if we touch a hot plate. It's, our bodies. Our symbolic self on the other side is our consciousness. It's our self that is composed of symbols and values and of abstract ideas how things ought to be. It's how we experience the world and make sense of it in our thoughts. It's our character, our unique self. And this is where things become interesting, because according to Becker, those two parts of ourselves are in conflict with each other. On the one side, we conceptualize ourselves as unique selves, as a soul or a character or a consciousness that is unique, creative, intelligent, spiritual, that lives and laughs, that has dreams and wishes and values. An immortal concept of ourselves that exists within us in an undefinable way. And on the other side, there is a body that gets sleepy, that aches, that gets horny at the most socially inappropriate times, that ages, that sometimes stinks, that gets sick, and that eventually will die one day. To quote Becker, "This is the paradox. Man is out of nature and hopelessly in it. He is dual, up in the stars and yet housed in a heart-pumping, breath-gasping body that once belonged to a fish and still carries the gill marks to prove it. His body is a material, fleshy casing that is alien to him in many ways. The strangest and most repugnant way being that it aches and bleeds and will decay and die. Man is literally split in two. He has an awareness of his own splendid uniqueness in that he sticks out of nature with a towering majesty, and yet he goes back into the ground a few feet in order blindly and dumbly to rot and disappear forever. It is a terrifying dilemma to be in and to have to live with." And this is where things become really interesting, and where freshly made human, ape ancestors come back into the picture. The very first people that were conscious of their mortality are the very first people confronted with this very problem. They were the first to be confronted with the problem of experiencing themselves as an immortal symbolic self that is trapped within a decaying body. So how did they solve this little mess? And Becker suspects that they solved it by coming up with culture. Culture in a broader sense. Be it religion, be it social status, be it wealth or moral superiority, be it a soccer team or the concept of a race or nation. Culture in a sense that people get together and decide that there is something of importance that exceeds the sum of its parts. Becker suspects that people came up with such collective, meaning-giving systems because within them, every single one of us is able to be part of something bigger. It helps us to come to terms with the conflict between our symbolic and our bodily self. So why is culture so useful to help us to get to terms with this conflict? Well, because culture gives our symbolic self a vessel with which it can conceptually immortalize itself. You see, our body may decay and die, but our contributions to cultural systems will survive our body. If we do something heroic, then our culture will remember us beyond our death. If we live by certain values of our culture and maybe even teach them to our kids or those around us, then those values will still be around even when we are no longer. If we live by the values of our religion, we might live in the belief that we literally immortalize ourselves by doing so. If we are of a certain nation, then every action we set during our lives contributes a tiny little bit to what it means to be of that nation, a nation that will survive us. If we create a wonderful piece of art, discover a scientific rule about the world, or are the first to achieve something in, say, sports, then a piece of art will still be around after our death, the scientific rule will still be true when we are no longer, and we will be the first person to achieve something for eternity. And even our sports team that we support for our whole lives will still be around when we are not, meaning that we contributed to something that survives us, even if it is something as trivial as this. What Becker basically argues is that most of the societal systems that we created over the course of human civilization actually help us to resolve the conflict of our symbolic self that realizes at some point that the body within it is trapped will die. Culture allows us to conceptualize parts of ourselves into eternity, parts of ourselves as immortal. So at some point, thousands and thousands of years ago, the first humans are forced to come to terms with the fact that they are mortal, and this is likely the time around which humans begin to develop cultural systems. But, and this is where things become interesting, it is not just those first humans that had to come to terms with their own mortality. As Becker argues, every single one of us goes through a similar experience as a child. At some point as a child, every one of us realizes that we will die, just as our ancestors did thousands of years ago. And this realization is terrifying. You see, we're born into this world and have absolutely no understanding of it. We're born and have no idea of nations and taxes and environmental problems. We do not know how baseball is played. We don't understand what sexuality is or what language is. We do not know what it means to be human. We do not even know what it means to have a body. But slowly, we figure those things out as children. We learn that we are a body. We learn that we need certain things to do well. We learn that there is a sensation we call pain, that we regularly require sleep and food, that our bodies can be permanently maimed, and finally, that our body will die one day, no matter what we do. That we will die one day. And so will our parents, our siblings, and everyone we love. And this realization might be a bit much for a 4-year-old. As a matter of fact, it might be a bit much for anyone, no matter the age. Becker argues that this realization is too much for man to bear, and thus we now have to come up with mechanisms that allow us to cope with this little problem. And we cope with it via the same mechanisms that the first humans did. We do it via culture. We come up with personal cultural projects via which we immortalize ourselves. Becker calls those projects Kasasui projects or immortality projects. Wikipedia defines them as the following. A person's Kasasui project acts as their immortality vessel, whereby they subscribe to a particular set of culturally created meanings, and through them gain personal significance beyond that afforded to other mortal animals. This enables the individual to imagine at least some vestige of those meanings continuing beyond their own lifespan, thus avoiding the complete self-negation that we perceive when other biological creatures die in nature. So what does such an immortality project might look like in reality? Well, it might be us trying to create a great work of art that will survive us, or us fighting for a political idea that will exist long after our death. It might be us trying to achieve something extraordinary in sports, or us trying to become exceedingly wealthy and powerful. It might be us raising children. It might be us trying to make a breakthrough in science. It might be via religion, or it might be us living along the values of a peer group in the hopes of becoming a heroic figure for it. Heck, even trying to be the first one who achieves a certain speedrunning record is one way of striving for symbolic immortality by our cultural values. An immortality project, as Becker thought about it, can be pretty much anything. The point is not the project itself. The point that is important for our analysis of Outer Wilds is that we need to find some projects that exceed our own existence to be able to deal with the fact that we're all going to die. And this, gentle ladies, gentlemen, and gentle people in general, is why we started this little chapter with the story of Mallory and Irvin, the two people that died trying to climb Everest for the very first time. Being the very first person to reach the top of Mount Everest is a purely symbolic achievement. If we remove all layers of culture, being the first one on a mountaintop is literally meaningless. If we remove culture, it is just someone standing somewhere. Only once we know that no one stood there before, and only once we know that the mountain is the highest on the planet, and only once we know how difficult it is to get up there, and only once we know that if one person were able to make the climb, then it would prove for all of humanity that our species is capable of climbing such a mountain. It is only once we know all those cultural ideas that reaching the top of Mount Everest becomes meaningful. You know, we are giving the mountain meaning, not the other way around. We're giving the mountain so much meaning, as a matter of fact, that even today, people are willing to take on insane risks to reach the top. There are people out there that are willing to accept an incredible amount of hardship and a very actual chance of death just to reach the top of the mountain. But even more importantly, even today, 100 years later, we're still fascinated by the question whether Mallory died on his way up or on his way down. Being the first on Everest is the mother of all immortality projects. The fact that we do not know with certainty who achieved it fascinates us to this day. And with this, we're almost ready to make sense of Outer Wilds DLC. Just let me quickly introduce another friendly fellow for reasons that will make sense in about half an hour. This little guy here called Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher and theologian who wrote down a lot of interesting ideas about 180 years ago. His philosophy is in lots of ways quite similar to the one of Nietzsche, with one crucial difference. Where Nietzsche ended up declaring God for dead, Kierkegaard concluded that therefore the only way to live is as a faithful servant of God. He was quite religious, even though he really wasn't a fan of the church of his time. So Kierkegaard isn't important for us right now, he's just checking in because Becker is deeply inspired by his work, and Kierkegaard will pop up again before the end of the universe. Awesome. So with this, we've established everything that we need to understand the story of Echoes of the Eye. Let's return to our dying universe and let's finally figure out what happened to the strange race of owl elks in the past. Long before the events of the game, yet even before the Nomai entered the solar system, the Owl Elks received a strange signal. A signal that was older than the universe itself. The signal of the eye of the universe. The signal fascinated the peaceful race that was living on a moon. They decided to follow it. But to reach it, they had to pay a price. To be able to reach the signal, they built a space station. The very space station that we will explore many years later. But to build this space station, they had to destroy their homeworld. They stripped down all the resources of their moon until there was nothing left of it. When they set out, they had nowhere to return to anymore. Eventually, they reached the solar system, close to the eye, our solar system. But there, they made a terrible discovery. They analyzed the eye of the universe, and then they learned the truth. The eye is searching for an observer that allows it to end the entire universe. If the Owl Elks were to visit the eye of the universe, they would destroy everything there is. They would end the very existence of everything. This had to be prevented. No one should ever be able to reach the eye. And thus they built a new device, a powerful one. They built a device capable of silencing the signal that the eye of the universe was sending out. As long as no one reached the eye, the universe can't die after all. And as long as no one was able to receive the signal of the universe, no one would be able to find it. They silenced the signal and then they disguised their own space station. But with this, the poor Owl Elks were stuck in a terrible situation. They didn't wish to finish their journey to the eye of the universe, but they also had nowhere to return to anymore. They desperately wanted to return home, but there was no home to return to. After all, they had destroyed their homeworld. It was then that they came up with an idea. While it was no longer possible to actually return to their home planet, they still remembered it. They still knew what it was that they had lost. They couldn't return to their real home, but at least they could still simulate it. and thus they crafted a virtual replication of their homeworld. They came up with a tool that allowed them to transfer their consciousness into a simulation, namely the blue candles. If the owl elks fell asleep close to the fire while they had a burning candle in their hand, then their consciousness would be transferred into a simulation of their homeworld. And so, one by one, they fell asleep. They left their bodies behind and entered the simulation. And there they are. Even today, the bodies that they left behind have long died and decayed, but their spirits still live in the simulation they crafted. In this simulation, their spirits are immortalized for eternity. And this is where things become interesting, because of course, we can enter this very simulation as well. If we grab one of the candles and fall asleep close to the decaying bodies of the owl elks, then our consciousness is transferred into the simulation too. And this is where all the things that we just discussed before finally pop up again. You see, Echoes of the Eye's entire story is a commentary on death and immortality. The eye of the universe is metaphorically death. Metaphorically and actually quite literally. If the owl elks were to meet the eye, they would literally end the universe. The end of their journey is literal death. So we discussed the ideas of Becker before. Becker argued that the realization that we're all heading towards death traumatizes us. He argued that the terror of death is too much for us to bear, and that we instead look for projects by which we try to immortalize ourselves. And this is surprisingly similar to what the owl elks did, isn't it? Soon after setting out, they realized that they're heading towards certain death, a realization that terrified them. So instead of facing their mortality, they instead looked for ways to immortalize themselves. And in the game, they actually found a way to do so. First, they repressed the fact that everything will die. They repressed the signal that the eye is sending out. They literally repressed the call for death in the universe. And then they literally immortalized their symbolic self. They transferred their consciousness into a simulation, in which it is immortal. They leave their bodies behind to die and to decay, while their spiritual selves live on for eternity. So did this make the poor owl elks happy? Did this bring them peace? Well, no. Eventually, we sneak into a mansion, and there we encounter an owl elk watching something. Something important. A reel depicting scenes of the owl elk's home moon. Even today, thousands of years after they first arrived in the solar system, they're still longing for a past that is irreversibly lost. So with this, we know almost everything that had happened on the space station in the past. Everything but one crucial detail. What is locked away in the sarcophagus? What did the owl elks so desperately want to lock away? Well, there's only one way for us to find this out. We have to break the seals. We have to release whatever the owl elks locked away. So how to open the prison? Well, there are 3 statues on 3 islands in the simulation. Each of those islands contains a contraption that allows us to deactivate one seal. There's just one problem. Those islands are well guarded. Each one has a unique security measurement to prevent us from reaching it. The only way to reach the islands is to enter a combination code to deactivate the security measurements. But those codes were destroyed by the owl elks. There's no way left for us to ever deactivate the security measures. We have to cheat them. If we continue to explore the simulation, we eventually learn more about its nature. We learn that it is possible to enter the simulation by dying instead of falling asleep. If we are dead, however, nothing in the simulation can ever wake us up again. We learn that the candle that we are carrying is what gives the simulation its appearance. If we get away far enough from the candle, then the true nature of the simulation suddenly becomes visible. Finally, we learn that the simulation has to load its different environments whenever we drive through a tunnel. Theoretically, it is possible to jump off of a raft while the simulation is loading, causing the simulation to glitch out and for us to reach places out of bounds. And with all this knowledge, we can actually brute force our way into the islands. We enter the simulation by dying, because then the alarm system is no longer able to wake us up, which allows us to reach the first island. We jump off the raft while it is loading, which allows us to go out of bounds and to reach the second island from behind. Finally, we're able to brute force our way through the third combination lock by leaving the lantern behind, because this allows us to see the invisible bridge that the different combination inputs are actually forming. And with this, we break the final seal. The sarcophagus opens. There is a dark entrance behind it. Locked away in it is the final secret of Echoes of the Eye. And thus we enter the coffin. We're about to find out what terrified the owl elks so much. We enter the sarcophagus. It is dark, we can barely see anything. What did the owl elks so desperately want to seal away? What is locked up in this horrible place? The stairs lead us down into a dark room with an elevator. We take the elevator. It takes us down even further. We're now at the deepest point of the simulation that we've ever been. We don't know if we're in danger. Slowly we descend. We reach another room. But what is this? Right in front of us is another candle. As we get closer, suddenly a hand, a creature, out of the shadow, another owl elk steps. This is what they wanted to lock away so badly. One of their own. They locked away one of their own for millennials. What terrible crime did this owl elk commit? Well, luckily, he is about to tell us. A while after the owl elks had entered their eternal slumber, one of them decided to awaken again. The prisoner. Slowly he snuck out of his resting place and made his way to the switch that controls the mechanism that is repressing the eye. And there, he flipped the switch. He turned off the mechanism that was repressing the signal of the eye of the universe. For a very short moment, the eye was able to call out for an observer again. But it was only for a very short moment. Soon, the other owl elks discovered what had happened. The prisoner had put all of them into great danger. If someone were to find the eye, they all were to die after all. Immediately, they reactivated the device. They had to make sure that something like this could never happen again. They had to prevent the eye from ever being able to call for destruction again. And thus they built the underwater prison and the sarcophagus. And there, they locked the prisoner away. The prisoner wanted to face extinction. He didn't want to hide from it. And thus, they had to lock him away to keep themselves safe. And then, the best moment in the entire DLC happens. The prisoner now asks us what our journey was. How did we end up here? And thus, we show it to him. And then, the music kicks in. A new chapter is added to the story, a chapter that describes our own journey. We tell the prisoner how all the owl elks slowly died while the space station decayed. The space station kept floating around in space, its inhabitants long dead, the place still firmly hidden. And then we tell the prisoner about the signal that he had set free, because the brief moment the signal was released was enough for someone to notice it. Another alien race, traveling on a vessel, an alien race called the Nomai. As soon as they realized that the signal was older than the universe, they immediately warped close to it. And as we know, the poor Nomai warped straight into dark bramble. Only 2 life pods managed to escape. The few surviving Nomai rebuilt their civilization step by step until a terrible catastrophe wiped all of them out. Slowly their buildings decayed and their culture got forgotten. Until our ancestors arrived thousands of years later and began to study the remains of the Nomai civilization. We dig up their artifacts, we learn to decipher their language, we put their relics into a museum, and in this very museum, we ourselves one day learn about the Nomai. We become fascinated with their past. We ourselves decide to become an astronaut and to study what they left behind. But one day, we encounter something strange. As we're exploring the solar system, we investigate the artifact that the deep space satellite is recording and end up in the hidden space station, which leads us to this very moment. I really love how we retell our story to the prisoner here. The music, our own story, how we got here, the illustrations, it all adds together to this wonderful moment in which we reflect on our journey. It's really great. After telling the tale, the prisoner screams out loud. Our new friend takes the elevator and leaves us alone for a moment. Once the elevator returns, we return to the surface as well. And there, we make one final discovery. The prisoner is nowhere to be seen. All there is are new footsteps that lead towards the water. The prisoner stepped into the water outside. He extinguished his own flame. But before the prisoner did this, he left behind one final vision for us. A short vision of the 2 of us sailing into the sunset. And with this, the story of the DLC already comes to an end. It ends with the prisoner extinguishing his own flame. It ends with the prisoner deliberately leaving the simulation and returning his consciousness back to his dead body. The DLC ends with the prisoner ending his own existence. Which is a bit weird, isn't it? Why would they decide to end the story like this? Why did they have us free a prisoner over the course of the entire game, only for the freed prisoner to immediately, well, Kill himself. What do they want to tell us with this? Why tell a story about a prisoner being freed by us only for the prisoner immediately ending his own existence? What did they have in mind here? And I believe I know at least parts of the answer to those questions, because the story of the Echoes of the Eye DLC shares a lot in common with another story that has been retold quite often. Echoes of the Eye's plot echoes the plot of a completely different story. A story that is 2,500 years old. Imagine a group of people imprisoned in a cave. Their necks and bodies are fixated so that they can only look at a wall in front of them. Behind them, there is a fire burning. This fire casts shadows at the wall in front of them. And then there are some people behind them that carry objects in front of the flame in such a way that the people can see the shadows of the objects. The idea is the following. If the people were to ever only see the shadows of objects in front of them, only ever the shadows, but never the real thing, then they would probably eventually mistake the shadows of the objects with the real thing after a while. After all, they never saw anything else but a shadow. But now imagine the following. Imagine one of the prisoners actually manages to break free. He leaves the cave and stumbles into true sunlight. Little by little, he would see reality for what it truly is. He would realize that what he believed to be reality was just a shadow, an illusion cast onto a wall. What would happen now if this person were to return back to the other prisoners in the cave and to tell them that what they believe to be reality isn't reality? As a matter of fact, their reality is just an illusion, a shadow cast on a wall. How would the other prisoners react? Well, this very question is the one that the author of this little tale was asking himself. The author of this little story is a fellow called Socrates, and it was written down by another nice chap called Plato. The story is Plato's allegory of the cave, and it is one of the most central thought experiments in all of human philosophy, and probably one of the most influential tales ever told, for reasons that we will talk about in a second. You see, Socrates believed that the people in the cave wouldn't be too happy about the return of a person that saw reality. Socrates argues that when he now tells the other prisoners about the world outside, that when he encourages them to escape with him, that the prisoners probably would deduce that the outside world blinded the prisoner, that the world outside their cave is therefore terribly dangerous, and in turn they would likely kill the escaped prisoner as well as anyone who would try to drag them out of their cave. Hooray! So why is this weird little ancient tale of such huge importance? Well, because this little story ended up being incredibly influential for a cute little sect in ancient Rome called Christianity. Our idea of heaven originates at least partly in this very tale. You see, for Plato, we are all prisoners. The flame behind us is actually the sun. The shadows in front of us is the world in which we exist. And above us, there is a Rome that is more real than ours. For Plato, this true Rome is the Rome of forms. A plane in which things exist in their pure, flawless and perfect version. A version that can't be found in our flawed reality. The thing that is important to understand here is that this perfect Rome of forms is no metaphor for Plato. He thinks about this as real. Socrates and Plato believed that there was another Rome out there, a better one that we can't reach. Another perfect Rome into which our souls will eventually go once they are no longer imprisoned by our bodies. And they believed that people would get mad if someone told them that the world around us isn't the end of all things but merely an illusion. An almost prophetic belief, given what we did to an unlucky fellow called Jesus a couple of hundred years later, or to poor Socrates himself. Socrates was also sentenced to death. So Socrates' Rome of forms ended up being incredibly influential in the emergence of our modern idea of heaven. You know, the idea that there is a better place above us to which our souls will eventually go is not biologically wired into us. Someone had to come up with this idea at some point. And it's Socrates who is on record for being the first person to think that the Rome in which we exist is imperfect and that we're all stuck here waiting until we eventually reach a better Rome of perfection above us. An idea that Christianity eventually picks up and runs with. So the allegory of the cave is a story that Plato tells to help us understand his idea of our existence being merely an imperfect illusion. But the allegory of the cave is also the story of Echoes of the Eye. You see, both stories feature a fake reality in which people live. The cave and the Simulation. Both stories feature a prisoner who escapes this fake reality, the prisoner that leaves the cave and the prisoner that leaves the simulation. And both stories end with the people who live in the simulation becoming angry at the one who escaped the fake reality. The people in the cave murdering the prisoner and the people in the simulation imprisoning him. There's just one crucial difference. Echoes of the Eye flips the allegory on its head. It inverts Plato's telling of the cave allegory. You see, in Plato's tale, real reality is the Rome that we have to escape from. But in Outer Wilds, it's the Rome we have to escape to. Plato has us imprisoned in reality. Outer Wilds has us imprisoned in a virtual simulated paradise. For Plato, our reality is not the real one, and we should strive for a different Rome, a Rome beyond this life. In Echoes of the Eye, the Owl Elks are living in a simulated paradise that grants them immortality. In Plato's tale, people get angry at a person that saw heaven. In Outer Wilds, the people get angry at the person that saw reality. It's the story flipped on its head. The morals of Plato's story is that our reality is imperfect, but that our souls will eventually return to the perfect Rome above us. In Echoes of the Eye, however, the moral of the story is the opposite. It is that our reality, the very reality in which we die, is the actual Rome to strive for, and that a symbolic Rome of virtual immortality is not the place to be. The hero of Echoes of the Eye is the prisoner after all. It is the person that decided to escape virtual immortality and to deactivate the repression mechanism of death. And this idea, the idea that we should face the reality of our mortality and not strive for a virtual Rome of immortality, is at the center of Echoes of the Eye's story. And with this, gentlemen, gentle ladies, and gentle people in general, we can return to the very question from the beginning of the video. So is it actually a good idea to freeze oneself after death? Is it a good idea to live this life in the belief that we will be eventually immortal? Let's once again pretend for a second that all of this wasn't pseudoscience, and let's pretend it would actually work. Would it be a good idea for us to live in the belief that we are immortal? And Outer Wilds clearly takes the stance that this is a bad idea. It would mean that we would live like the Owl Elks trapped in the simulation, and not like the prisoner. The game argues that we do the exact opposite. It argues for us not to try to look for a Rome of literal immortality, but to instead deactivate the repression of our death and to face it heads on, to live in reality and be aware of death. This is the reason why the prisoner in the end has to walk into the water. The Owl Elks represent an escape of mortality. The prisoner opposes this idea. He symbolizes the acceptance of death. But why does Outer Wilds take this stance? Why does the game argue for us to live in the face of our mortality, instead for us striving for an immortal existence? And Becker actually gave us the answer to this question just before. You see, Becker argues that it is the terror of our understanding of our own evanescence that makes us human in the first place. Animals, after all, are not aware of their mortality. So, if we were to truly believe that we are immortal, then we would actually transcend humanity, just not in the direction we planned. To live in the belief that we are immortal would mean that we walk back down a step on the ladder of evolution, not up, back down, back to the same step on which cats, dogs and humpback whales are existing. It means that we would return back to a state in which we don't need culture or values to immortalize ourselves. If we are immortal, or at least believe ourselves to be, then all our meaning-giving systems collapse. We just don't need them anymore. Living in the belief that we are immortal would mean that our bodily self and our symbolic self are finally at peace with each other, as is the case for creatures that do not realize that they are mortal. If the realization of man's mortality is the moment in which apes became man, then the illusion of immortality would be the tool by which man can become ape again. So whether one wants to get rid of one's human essence, or if one prefers to acknowledge it, is obviously up for everyone themselves to decide. But at least Echoes of the Eye makes the argument that it is better not to repress death, but instead to wake up, accept it, live a meaningful life, and in the end accept that we will return to the water eventually. Awesome. So with this, we're almost done with the Echoes of the Eye DLC. almost, because there's one small but crucial thing that the DLC still adds to the base game that we haven't yet taken a look at. The ending of the base game changes slightly now that the prisoner is free. We have to take another look at the actual ending of the game. And thus, we hop into our little spaceship for one final time. We fly to the Ash Twins, we wait for the tower to submerge, we enter the Ash Twin project, we grab the core, we fly towards Deep Bramble, we may or may not get eaten once or twice in an unfortunate anglerfish incident before we finally reach the vessel. We swap the core, enter the launch codes and warp towards the eye of the universe for one final time. And then we walk into the quantum storm. We jump into the nothingness of the eye. We reflect on our journey in the museum. We begin the process of birthing a new universe. We run into our own self and watch it die. We form a campsite around the remains of our old self. And now we receive signals from all our friends. And among them, there is a signal that we never heard before. We receive a new signal, a song played by an instrument that we never heard in the base game. We follow it. The signal leads us to a tree, but not just any tree. There is a gravestone right in front of it. Behind the grave, there is a small hut with a gear mechanism. We rotate the gear and it shows us our final slide reel. As we keep rotating, the ground in front of the tombstone opens up. We're literally opening a grave here, and then we jump into this grave. The symbolism here should be obvious. Jumping into a grave is again us symbolically facing our own death. And it's not the last symbolism for this. Inside the grave, we find pictures of the different creatures we met on our journey. There are the Nomai, there are the Owl Elks, and there are pictures of Hearthians. And in front of those pictures, there are candles burning. We have to blow out those candles. Thus, we blow out the candle in front of the Hearthians. Suddenly the screen fades to black, and as there is light again, we see that the Hearthians are no longer in the pictures. We blow out the candles in front of the Nomai. The Nomai technology remains in the picture, but the Nomai are suddenly gone. And so are the Owl Elks once we blow out their candles. As we blew out the last candle, as the last rays disappeared, the door finally opens. So blowing out the candles here is once again, say it with me, a symbolism for dying. What we metaphorically do in this scene is acknowledge that all the races we met during the game will be gone at some point. We metaphorically kill them to acknowledge their eventual disappearance. We acknowledge the mortality of everything there is. But there is one final candle that we have not yet blown out. There is one final death that we symbolically have to accept before we are ready to confront the eye of the universe. The final candle we have to blow out is in front of a mirror. We're now looking at ourselves. We're blowing out our own candle. We look at ourselves and we acknowledge that we will die. We talked a lot about Becker and his ideas of immortality projects in this video. So if Becker is to be believed, then all of us unconsciously believe in ideas and work towards projects that allow us to immortalize ourselves in a certain way via systems of culture. As we discussed before, Becker basically argues that the very fact that we die, the knowledge that we are a symbolic self trapped in a decaying body, is too much for us to bear. We need to come up with plans that allow ourself to extend itself beyond our body. We cannot exist with the permanent acknowledgement that we are mortal and will soon return to nothing but dust, as will anybody else. And yet, here we are, at the end of Echoes of the Eye, and over again, the game reminds us symbolically that we will die. The literal objective of the DLC is to open up a coffin and to enter it. The ending has us dig a grave. It has us jump into a grave. We blow out the candles in front of everyone close to us and watch them disappear. And now we are here, in front of a mirror, literally blowing out a candle while looking at ourselves. I mean, at that point, it's not exactly subtle anymore, is it? But if Becker is right in his belief that we can't handle the terror of our own death while still remaining a functioning human being, then why is Outer Wilds so obsessed with reminding us of exactly this? Aren't those two ideas paradoxical? Doesn't the idea that we all need some projects to immortalize ourselves because we can't handle our mortality run counter to the idea that we should live in full awareness of our mortality? And interestingly, the answer is no. Not necessarily. Here's the thing, in our original hot take on Outer Wilds base game, we talked a lot about how the ending of Outer Wilds can be read as an existentialist metaphor for accepting responsibility over our own lives that leads to re-evaluation of our own values. While making this argument, we took a look at a couple of ideas by a nice little fellow called Jean-Paul Sartre, the father figure of existentialism. So let's pull out Daddy Existentialism again and see if he can help us solve our little paradox. Here's a fun little Sartre quote. I think of death only with tranquility as an end. I refuse to let death hamper life. Death must enter life, only to define it. And this idea here, the idea that death must enter life only to define it, is the core message of the game, at least in my humble interpretation. You see, if Becker is right, which I personally do think he is to a certain degree, then we're all filled to the brim with little projects, values and ideas that we all need to project our brittle mortal selves into something that will exist beyond us. We are filled to the brim with immortality projects that help us make sense of our lives. But barely any one of us ever chose those projects consciously. Most of us are just clinging to the first best thing that randomly entered our lives. Most of us never consciously chose the system by which we try to immortalize ourselves. Again, an immortality project can be almost anything. It can be art that we create. It can be us trying to push the limits of what is humanly possible in sports, in science, or be it speedrunning. It can be anything where humans enter a form of competition, but it doesn't need to be. The idea to live one's life in such a way that the life of just one person was better because of our existence is in a certain way an immortality narrative. It can be political ideas. If we fight for progressive ideals, we try to immortalize ourselves via those. If we fight for conservative values, like that the traditions and ways of our communities are not forgotten, that those traditions carry on beyond ourselves, then that's an immortality project. Our sports team can be an immortality project, making sure that the local library is well run can be one. Having a podcast is a way to immortalize oneself, becoming exceptional at a skill is, whatever the skill might be, being richer or more powerful than anyone around us is, dominating other people and being able to forcefully change how their lives turn out is such a project. So is it to tie our identity to conspiracy theories? So it's easy to make fun of people that ended up with immortality projects that are illogical or that are actually hurting them, but are we ourselves so different? Most of us did not choose their immortality vessels consciously. Did we? Most of us are just thrown into the absurdness of the human condition and cling to the first immortality narrative that we happen to stumble upon. Maybe we were born into a conservative area and thus cling onto conservative values. Maybe our parents are fans of a sports team and thus we cling onto those ideas. Maybe there's a really cool kid in our school that is really into wood carving, and that's why we immortalize ourselves via our artful wood carvings decades later. Maybe we have a cool physics teacher in school and scientific progress ends up being one of our immortality projects. Maybe YouTube happened to recommend some YouTuber to us during our early teens, and via his influence we came to believe that there is a dark circle of evil wizards trying to destroy video games, and that's how we ended up spending our entire 20s on 4chan. Maybe our parents always valued academic knowledge, and that's why we chose this as our vessel for immortality. Or maybe we just stumbled into a cool group of people in a Discord server, and that's how we ended up throwing pamphlets about adulterated honey down the aula of our college. Or maybe something somewhere goes terribly wrong and our immortality project ends up being a terror attack. The point here is that while most of us have immortality projects that define our lives, the fewest of us actually really chose those for ourselves. Often we just end up clinging to the very first thing that life throws in our path. And don't get me wrong, sometimes that ended up being exactly what we needed. Sometimes that's just great, but sometimes it isn't. And this brings us back to Outer Wilds. It brings us back to the acknowledgement of mortality and the idea that death has to enter life to define it. The thing is the following. As I understand Echoes of the Eye, the game challenges us to look at ourselves through a lens of death. It wants us to reflect on the question of what our current life means in the face of our mortality. What do we leave behind if we continue to live as we are? It wants us to be conscious of the fact that we die, that there is nothing that we can do about it, and that if we all eventually have to leave this world behind, it wants us to consider what we will eventually leave behind. It wants us to take a look in a mirror and ask ourselves a question. if we look at ourselves, if we blow out our own candle, do we like what we see? Have we actually chosen for ourselves what we want to leave behind one day? Or is our life based on the projects and values of other people? You know, if Becker is right, and if we all can only bear our existence by having projects that in some form translate our symbolic self into the future, far beyond the existence of our bodily self, then we will all necessarily have to come up with such projects. But if those projects aren't our own, but the immortality projects of someone else, then, well, that's kind of sad, isn't it? To live via someone else's narrative of immortality, just to be able to bear one's own existence, sounds pretty unfun to me. If we need immortality projects to make sense of our existence, then it is certainly a good idea to come up with those projects for ourselves. Because if we do not consciously choose what we want our lives to mean, then life will choose for us, and life does not always have our best interest at heart. So what do you want to leave behind? How do you want to be remembered? Is it for having raised wonderful children? Is it for having been an important member in your community who everyone ever was able to count on? Is it for fighting for a political idea you really believe in? Is it for being the only one in your peer group who understood that the earth is flat? Is it for having created great art that survived you? Is it for having been the richest guy in your neighborhood? Is it for having pushed the boundaries of what is humanly possible in sports or games or academia? Choose. As I understand it, this is what Echoes of the Eye is trying to tell us. We will die, so let's live our lives in a way that allows us to look into a mirror, to blow out the candle, and to still be at peace with what remains in the frame once our own image left it. So all of this talk about how we try to project ourselves into immortality via cultural values has a small problem. A small problem that is, however, very significant. So I honestly wasn't sure for the longest of time if I wanted to include the following argument into the video, because we just made this nice little existentialist case about taking responsibility for one's own life in the face of mortality. And it would be a real shame if we were to ruin it all now, wouldn't it? But there's a problem. I think we kind of have to, because Outer Wilds does so itself. We can't really understand the entire argument that Outer Wilds is making without throwing a huge curveball into the entire idea that we just came up with. So here's the problem. Nothing we will ever do will ever be able to truly immortalize us, because everything that is will eventually perish one way or another. We might be able to live in such a way that culture remembers us for dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of years, but eventually everyone will be forgotten. Eventually, the earth will crash into the sun. Eventually, even the sun will die. And while we do not know the ultimate fate of the universe with certainty, what we do know seems to hint at the fact that even the universe will eventually die. But if we know with certainty that everything that we will ever do will eventually be meaningless, if we know that there is absolutely no way to do anything of cosmic significance, if we can be certain that everything we ever do will be eventually meaningless and that everything we ever achieve will fade away, then why do anything at all? You know, our existence is just of utter cosmic insignificance. Nothing we will ever do will matter on a cosmic scale. It doesn't matter if we get sick, it doesn't matter if our loved ones die, it doesn't matter who is governing us, what art we create, whom we love, if we are loved, if people live by values similar to ours, if our culture perishes or if our nation disappears, if we are successful in life or live under a bridge, if we get cancer or have a lot of money, and so on. Nothing truly matters on a cosmic scale. So why get up in the morning? Why go to work? Why care for values? Why be kind or selfish? Why even do anything? Why live at all? Why care about social justice or values or morals? Nothing we will ever do will ever matter on a cosmic scale. We might be able to achieve something that persists for a while after our death, but no matter what we achieve, it will all eventually fade. And we all know this on one layer or another. We usually don't think about it, but in a certain way we are aware of those things. And there are just two ways how to deal with all of this. We can either repress it or face it heads on. So if we repress it, our path through life is clear. Then we use cultural idols to give our lives an illusion of importance, be it money or beauty or power or hedonism or certain political ideas or even art and science. We find a system in which we gain the illusion that our lives are not cosmically meaningless, and then we can happily live our little lives worrying about the small problems of our existence. But what if we don't want to do this? What if we want to face it? How to live in the knowledge of cosmic meaninglessness? How to live in the knowledge that not only we are going to die, but that even the projects and the ways by which we try to immortalize ourselves are ultimately meaningless. This is where another quote of Becker comes into play, a quote that reminds me very much of the ending of Outer Wilds. And this is where you all got to know Søren Kierkegaard a while back, because Becker is talking about the ideas of Kierkegaard in the quote. Once the person begins to look to his relationship to the ultimate power, to infinitude, and to refashion his links from those around him to that ultimate power, he opens up to himself the horizon of unlimited possibility, of real freedom. This is Kierkegaard's message. One goes through it all to arrive at faith. The faith that one's very creatureliness has some meaning to a creator, that despite one's true insignificance, weakness and death, one's existence has meaning in some ultimate sense, because it exists within an eternal and infinite scheme of things, brought about and maintained to some kind of design by some creative force. You see, Kierkegaard was an early existentialist thinker, but unlike most of the other existentialist thinkers, he was a deeply faithful and religious person. His realization of ultimate human freedom ultimately led him to God, not away from it. And I don't think it makes sense to discuss Outer Wilds without also talking about God, because God is omnipresent in the story. That is, God is a creative force that created existence, not in a Christian sense. Because the eye of the universe is a godlike force in Outer Wilds universe. It is literally what created the universe, and it is what will end it. And Outer Wilds puts this very force, this force of creation, at the center of the new self that we metaphorically create for us at the end of Outer Wilds. Here's the thing, if we ask ourselves what the cosmic meaning of our existence is, then we will always come to the realization that there is none. There's just no cosmic meaning to be gained by our little human possibilities. It's just not possible. But I sometimes wonder if this might not be the wrong question to ask. Because if we remove all the inauthentic parts of our character, if we accept responsibility for our lives and for our existence, if we acknowledge our mortality and live our lives according to the values that remain in us, once we deconstruct the entire rest, then we just exist as we are. And I don't think it is necessary for authentic existence to justify itself. You know, immortality projects are in a certain way attempts of the self to justify its own existence. It's narratives that we use to justify why we do the things we do. It's little psychological tricks that we play ourselves to give our actions an additional illusion of meaning and significance. But in the end, there is no way around the fact that it is not possible to gain cosmic significance. It is, however, also true that we exist. We don't know why, we don't know how, we don't know anything about the reasons we exist. We do have religious narratives that try to make sense of it, and for some people those narratives are good enough. For many they are not. But independent of all of this, there's just no way around the fact that we exist. And you know, maybe that's enough. Maybe existence doesn't need to justify itself. Maybe we don't need to justify our actions, our being, who we are, what we desire, what we value, and so on, as long as it is an authentic representation of what we truly are. Maybe the fact that we are, who we are, that we value what we value, and that we merely exist is enough to justify our actions. So earlier we talked about George Mallory, the person who died on Everest, trying to be the first one to ascend it. Up until today, people are fascinated with the question of whether he managed to be the first person atop the mountain or not. But there's one aspect to the story that I haven't told you yet. You see, before Mallory set out to climb the mountain, he was asked why he wanted to climb it in the first place. And Mallory gave an incredibly intelligent answer, at least in my humble opinion. He didn't answer that he wants to climb the mountain, because it would mean a lot to the British nation if he was the first one to climb it. He did not answer that he wanted to climb it because he wanted to prove what humanity is capable of. He didn't answer that he wanted to do it for science or fame or to test what he himself was capable of. His answer was nothing like this. George Mallory answered the question of why he wanted to climb the mountain that eventually killed him with the words, "Because it is there." And I honestly believe that this is the most intelligent answer that one can give to such a question. Hooray! So here we have it, an encouraging essay about death and decay. Before we wrap this up, just a couple of things. So first, a gigantic Death of the Universe repressing thank you to all my incredible patrons whose names are currently scrolling by. So this video is unlikely to pull a lot of views, since it is about a DLC of an indie game and a very hard sell clickbait wise. Producing this video would 100% absolutely no way ever have been possible for me without the generous support of the people whose names are currently scrolling by. A huge and gigantic thank you for this. Second, a couple of notes on Outer Wilds' ending that I wanted to put into the script but it didn't fit. So Outer Wilds' ending is quite interesting because it can be read in so many different ways. In the original video we interpreted it as a metaphor of Sartre and living authentically, but we can also easily read it as Kierkegaard, who is telling us to shed our lie of character, to face the anxiety of the possibility of possibility, and to link our free selves to the power of creation. Heck, we can even read it as a metaphor for Nietzsche's eternal reoccurrence, and as a call for re-evaluation of all values. And that's just from the top of my head. I believe the main reason why the ending can be looked at via so many different existentialist lenses is because all of those ideas share a similar philosophical core, that is the terror of ultimate freedom. Cool. Also, before I forget it, I referred to the prisoner in the sarcophagus as male in the video. That's mainly because most of the time people in the community talk about him as male, but technically that's an assumption. The prisoner could equally be female or genderless for all we know. The game never confirms the gender of the character. Awesome. So the next couple of videos will be a bit more lighthearted, and over on the gaming channel, it's been a bit much death, decay and existential crisis for me this past year. I honestly need some mushroom and kingdom as a change of pace to make sure I don't go even more insane. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you did, leaving a thumbs up is what the Eye of the Universe would do. If you're interested in more long-form content discussing great games, subscribing might be a good idea. And if you truly loved the video and want to make sure that content like this can survive on the platform, then there is also the option to support the channel via Patreon. Until next time, lots of hugs.